If you comb through America's oldest census records, you will find names and birthplaces simply listed as Black Indian. No controversy, no confusion, just fact. But before the century turned, those same identities quietly vanished from official memory, replaced by new labels and silence. They were erased, not by war, but by paperwork. Why did America need Black Indians hidden, and what else disappeared with them? In the earliest records kept by colonists and census takers, Black Indians were documented in plain sight. Colonial journals from the 1700s describe villages where Native and African people lived side by side, sometimes sharing families, customs, and land. These accounts do not hesitate or hedge. They speak of Black Indians as a matter of fact. In 1790, the first U.S. Census began grouping people by color and freedom status. Even then, some regional records named individuals as Black Indian or Mixed Indian with no footnotes and no explanations. In Maryland's 1776 census, surviving fragments list the first names of dozens of enslaved people, some noted in local tax records as Indian Negroes or Negroes and Indians together. By 1835, a census of the Cherokee Nation reported that 1 in 10 citizens had African ancestry. Early federal census sheets from the 1820s and the 1830s sometimes included columns for free colored persons living in Native households, entries that, in their own handwriting, confirmed the presence of Afro-Indigenous families. One census enumerator in North Carolina in 1830 wrote a single line listing Sarah as Indian, Black complexion, age 34, free. These are not rumors or legends. They are the government's own words, written in ink that has not faded. The names and categories were ordinary then, as if everyone understood who lived in these borderlands. There was no controversy and no anxious correction, just a record of who was there. Before the lines were redrawn, before the labels changed, the existence of Black Indians was an administrative fact. The proof sits in the ledgers, quiet but undeniable, waiting for the moment when the story would be told differently. Open the catalogs of America's vast archives, and the silence is louder than any denial. Search for photographs labeled Black Indian or Afro-Indigenous, and the results come back nearly empty. The records are not just missing, they were never cataloged, never preserved under those names. The void is not accidental. It is a kind of evidence in itself, a blank space where thousands of lives and families should be. Museums hold rows of portraits, but the faces are sorted by what someone else decided to see: Negro, Indian, colored, rarely both. Census records after the 1840s dropped the language of Black Indian that was once ordinary. Tribal roles, land deeds, and government files began to split people into new categories, erasing the overlap that had always existed in daily life. The absence of labeled footage is not a gap in history. It is the result of deliberate choices. Archivists, census takers, and clerks were told what to write and what not to write. As laws hardened, the paperwork began to do the work of erasure. Entire communities were renamed or left out, their stories scattered across ledgers under different labels. The silence in the archives is not a mystery. It is the mark of a system that decided some identities were too inconvenient to record. The missing images, the empty search results, the faded columns, these are not accidents. They are the fingerprints of a policy that made Black Indian identity disappear with a pen and a file box. This is how a people can be erased, not from the land, but from the memory of the nation. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, a law that would change the fate of indigenous nations across the United States. The Dawes Act ordered that communal tribal lands be divided into individual plots, but it also demanded a new kind of record keeping. Every person entitled to land had to be listed by name on an official roll. 11 years later, the Curtis Act of 1898 stripped away the last protections for tribal governments and forced the 5 tribes of Indian Territory, Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, to submit to federal enrollment. The Dawes Commission, set up to carry out this process, invented a system of categories that would decide the future of every applicant. There was the BY Blood roll, reserved for those the commission accepted as native by lineage. There was the Freedmen roll, for people of African descent who had once been enslaved by tribal citizens or who traced their roots to Black Indian families. There were also rolls for intermarried whites, adopted citizens, and denied cases. The labels were not just words. They determined who would receive land, who would be recognized as a tribal citizen, and who would be left out. Applicants sat before examiners, answering questions about family, ancestry, and community. The commission had the power to decide, often with little evidence, which role a person belonged on. For many Afro-Indigenous families, the outcome was already written. Even with clear ties to the tribe, they were placed on the Freedmen roll, separated from relatives listed as BI blood. This paperwork split families, erased shared history, and locked generations into categories that could not be changed. The Dawes and Curtis Acts turned identity into administration, a system where a checkmark on a form could erase a nation's memory. John Horse was born in Spanish Florida, the son of an enslaved African woman and a Seminole father, at a time when freedom was always in question. He became the leader of the Black Seminoles, a people who found themselves caught between three worlds: Native, African, and the rising white republic that wanted neither. During the Second Seminole War in the 1830s, John Horse stood before U.S. generals and Seminole chiefs alike, demanding liberty not just for himself, but for hundreds of Black families who had lived alongside the Seminole for generations. He spoke 3 languages, fought in 2 armies, and crossed 3 countries to keep his people from being dragged back into slavery. In 1849, after years of broken promises and threats from Creek slave raiders, John Horse led nearly 100 Black Seminoles out of Indian Territory. Their destination was Mexico, where slavery was outlawed. There, the Mexican government granted them land in exchange for military service. For a time, they found safety, but the struggle never ended. Even in exile, John Horse wrote letters and sent petitions asking the U.S. government to recognize the Black Seminoles as rightful members of the nation they had fought beside and bled for. The bureaucracy never answered. On paper, the Black Seminoles were listed as Negroes, runaways, or freedmen, never as Seminole. When the Dawes Commission arrived decades later to divide up tribal land, John Horse had already died in Mexico, but his descendants and those he led were placed on the Freedmen rolls and stripped of tribal identity and land rights. For John Horse, the fight was always against erasure by paperwork. His victories lived in memory and in the courage of his people, but the files told a different story. The harm was not just in what was denied, but in how a nation could erase a leader and his people with the stroke of a pen. That was bureaucratic erasure, quiet and final on paper. Oil pooled beneath the red dirt of Oklahoma, and for a brief moment, Black families who had survived the Dawes paperwork found themselves holding deeds to land no one expected to be valuable. Greenwood, known as Black Wall Street, rose from these allotments, built by the hands of Cherokee and Creek freedmen, their children, and their grandchildren. In 1921, that wealth became a target. Over 2 days, white mobs set fire to 35 city blocks, burning homes, businesses, and churches to the ground. Between 100 and 300 men, women, and children were killed. The records of ownership, deeds, tribal allotment papers vanished in the flames, along with proof of generational wealth. Paper erasure had prepared the ground. When violence came, there was nothing left to protect those whose existence had already been written out. For some, the loss was not just land or money, but the last trace of who they were supposed to be. Identity is still measured, counted, and challenged today. In the 2020 census, thousands of people who claim both Black and Native ancestry were missed or forced to choose one box, leaving whole families invisible on paper. Laws and tribal constitutions still use Dawes-era categories, dividing descendants of freedmen from those listed by blood. Marilyn Vann, a Cherokee freedman descendant, spent decades fighting in federal court to restore citizenship for families like hers. In 2017, a judge ruled that the Cherokee Nation must honor the 1866 treaty rights of freedmen, but the struggle continues. DNA tests offer answers for some, but not everyone's story fits a lab result. Oral history, family Bibles, and memories still carry what documents tried to erase. The fight is not over. Black Indians are still here, refusing to disappear, even when the paperwork says otherwise. Today, the erasure of Black Native identity still shapes who is seen, counted, or believed. As long as history remains written by exclusion, entire peoples live between the lines. The story is not over. It is waiting for those willing to read what was meant to be hidden. Drop your thoughts below.